There are houses that hold you even after you have left them. Not in the way that photographs hold moments, frozen, flat, without breath, but in the way that the body holds memory, in the tension of the shoulders when a certain kind of light falls through a curtain, in the particular stillness that descends on a Sunday afternoon when the world outside goes quiet and something inside you becomes very, very loud. My mother's house was that kind of house. I grew up in a home where love was expressed through action rather than words. My mother was not a woman who said, "I love you," easily. She said it through the careful folding of laundry, through the way she pressed a warm towel into your hands on a cold morning before you left for school, through the particular attention she gave to small things, the alignment of shoes by the door, the precise arrangement of flowers in the kitchen window, the hours she spent making sure that everything around her carried a quality of gentleness that the outside world did not always offer. She was a quiet woman, but her quiet was not emptiness. It was the quiet of deep water, still on the surface, full of movement beneath. I was her only child, a fact that shaped me in ways I am still discovering decades later. There was no sibling to absorb the particular intensity of her focus. There was no one else to receive the education she offered silently, through example, through the texture of daily life inside those walls. It was just the two of us, in that house where silence spoke more fluently than conversation, where the act of caring for small things was understood to be one of the highest forms of attention a person could offer. My father left when I was 4. I do not carry much memory of him. Only fragments, impressions, the outline of a large presence that one day was simply gone. My mother never spoke of it with bitterness. She spoke of it very little at all. What she did instead was turn her full attention to the life we had, to the space we shared, to the project of making that space worthy of the time we spent inside it. She taught me things without teaching them. That is perhaps the most accurate description of my childhood education. I learned from watching her move through rooms. I learned from the rhythm of her mornings, the particular order in which she prepared herself for the day, the unhurried quality of her attention, the way she treated her own body and appearance, not as vanity, but as a kind of respect. Respect for herself, respect for the day ahead, respect for the people she would encounter. I was a sensitive child. I understood this about myself even then, though I did not have the vocabulary to name it. I felt things intensely and was not always certain what to do with the feelings. The world outside the house, school, the neighborhood, the social architecture of childhood was often confusing to me. It operated according to codes I found difficult to read, reward structures I found difficult to value. I was not unhappy exactly, but I was often lonely in the particular way that sensitive children are lonely, surrounded by people and yet fundamentally alone in the experience of what it felt like to be yourself. At home, with my mother, this loneliness softened. Not because she filled it entirely, no other person can do that, but because she modeled something I had not found elsewhere. She modeled the possibility of being alone with yourself and finding that solitude gentle rather than harsh. She moved through her private routines with a kind of companionable relationship with her own inner life that I watched and absorbed and did not fully understand until much later. I used to sit in the doorway of her bedroom on weekend mornings and watch her brush her hair. There was something almost ceremonial about it. She did not rush. She moved the brush through with patience and attention, her eyes sometimes focused on her reflection in the mirror, sometimes distant, turned inward towards something I could not see. She was not performing for anyone. This was not a ritual designed for observation. It was simply the way she was with herself when no demands were being made of her. That image lived inside me for years before I understood what it meant. There is a particular kind of inheritance that moves not through instruction, but through witness. What my mother gave me was not a set of rules, or even precisely a set of values. It was something more primary than that, a way of relating to interior life, to private experience, to the self that exists when no one is watching. A quality of gentleness directed inward. An understanding that caring for oneself was not selfishness, but a kind of groundwork, a necessary foundation from which it became possible to face whatever the world required. I did not know I had inherited this. I did not know that the years of watching had planted something in me. Life intervened as it does. I grew up. I left the house. I moved into the complicated business of adult existence with its pressures and its losses and its relentless forward momentum, and the quiet lessons of my childhood receded into background, became substrate rather than surface, became the thing underneath everything else that I would not access consciously for many years. But they were there. They were always there, waiting in the silence. Waiting, perhaps, for me to become quiet enough to hear them. Adulthood arrived with a weight I had not anticipated. This is perhaps a common experience. The transition from the relative shelter of youth into the open exposure of adult life carries for many people a kind of shock. Not the dramatic shock of a single event, but the slow, cumulative shock of discovering that the world is harder and less forgiving than you had understood, that the internal resources you believed you had may not be quite sufficient for what is being asked of you. I was in my mid-20s when the weight first became undeniable. I had a job that demanded more than it returned. I had an apartment in a city that was loud and fast and entirely indifferent to the particular needs of a person like me. I had, for a time, a relationship that I hoped would provide the kind of quietness I had known in my mother's house, but which could not do that. Not because the person was unkind, but because that kind of quiet cannot be found in another person. It has to be found inside yourself. And I had not yet learned to find it. The loneliness of those years was different from the loneliness of childhood. The childhood loneliness had been soft around the edges. There had been the house and my mother, and the knowledge that inside those walls something gentle was available. The adult loneliness was harder, more angular. It had the quality of a room with no comfortable surfaces. You could not quite settle anywhere. I responded the way many people do. I pushed forward. I worked harder. I told myself that the discomfort was temporary, that things would ease when the next milestone was reached, when the career stabilized, when the relationship clarified, when life arranged itself into something more manageable. I kept the forward momentum going because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. But the internal pressure mounted. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from being too far from yourself for too long. I was experiencing that. The version of me that moved through offices and social situations and the daily transactions of adult life was functional, competent, reasonably well regarded. But there was a significant distance between that version and whatever was actually alive at the center of me, whatever the small boy sitting in his mother's doorway had been and felt and understood before the world began its work of reshaping. I think many people experience this distance and never quite address it. The gap between the public self and the private self simply becomes the normal condition of existence. You stop noticing it after a while, the way you stop noticing background noise once it has been present long enough. But I noticed it, and noticing it was uncomfortable. The first time I consciously thought about the specific form that comfort might take for me, I was alone in my apartment on a gray Saturday afternoon. I had nowhere to be. The silence in the apartment was not the comfortable silence of my mother's house. It was the flat silence of a space that had not yet been given any quality of intentionality. I was restless in the way I had been restless as a child when the world's social codes refused to organize themselves in ways I could understand. And then, I cannot entirely explain how this happened, because it felt less like a decision and more like a memory surfacing. I found myself in my own bathroom, moving slowly, with deliberate attention. Not rushing, not performing, simply being present with myself in a way that I had not allowed in a long time. I was not doing anything remarkable. I was simply being careful. Careful with time. Careful with attention. Careful with myself. Treating myself with the quality of gentle regard that I had watched my mother bring to her own private routines so many years before. And something in me, some tight, pressurized thing that had been held contracted for years, began, very slowly, to soften. I did not understand what had happened. I put it away. I returned to the ordinary momentum of the week. But I remembered it. Some part of me recognized that what I had touched in that quiet bathroom moment was important, was real, was connected to something I needed. The pattern was establishing itself. Not dramatically, not through decision. Through return, the slow, almost involuntary return to something that provided relief when relief was needed. I began, without naming it, to understand something about myself. Every person, I think, develops a private language. a set of internal codes and practices through which the self communicates with itself when the demands of the external world have temporarily loosened their grip. These private languages are rarely spoken about, partly because they are intimate, partly because language itself is an imperfect tool for things that exist below language, in the body and in felt experience. Mine developed slowly, over years, shaped by need and by the particular textures of my own inner life and by the inheritance I had received from watching a woman move through the world with a quality of care that I had absorbed before I knew I was absorbing it. What emerged for me was a practice that I can now describe, though describing it was not possible for a long time while I was inside it. It was a practice of deliberate gentleness toward myself within the private space of my own routines. A practice of slowing down, of paying attention to the quality of experience rather than just the functionality of action. A practice of bringing to my own private self-care something of the ceremonial patience I had witnessed so many times in my mother's simple, unhurried morning rituals. This practice had a specific texture. It involved care, the kind of care usually described in feminine terms, though I have come to believe that this description says more about cultural categories than about the nature of care itself. It involved softness as a quality of attention, gentleness as a mode of relating to one's own experience. It involved elements that the world I inhabited had not typically associated with people like me, with men in professional contexts, with adults managing the demands of ordinary life. There was, for a long time, some complexity in how I held this. Not shame, exactly. Though shame is the word the culture tends to reach for when describing anything that doesn't align with expected categories. It was more that I was uncertain of the framework in which to understand what I was doing and why it seemed to matter so much. I had been handed no ready-made language for this particular form of self-care, no cultural narrative in which someone like me arriving at this particular practice made immediate, comfortable sense. So I held it privately, carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you have not yet fully understood, but that you sense is valuable. I think about my mother's house during those years. I think about how she created a space that had a particular quality, not expensive, not elaborate, but intentional. Attended to. The kind of space where small things were considered and cared for because caring for small things was understood to matter. She had created, I realized, an environment that embodied a certain relationship to the self. That said, through its textures and its order and its quality of gentle attention, that the inner life of the person who inhabited it deserved careful consideration. I began to do the same. Not in any dramatic way. Not in any way that would have been visible to someone looking at my life from outside. But within the private architecture of my own space, my own time, my own habits, I began to build something. An environment that said, through its qualities, that I was worth gentleness. That my inner life deserved the same care I had watched my mother extend to herself, and to me. The crossdressing, if that word serves, though it has never quite captured the fullness of what I mean, began in this context. Not as costume, not as performance, not as an identity claimed against something else, but as extension of an already developing practice of gentleness, a further exploration of what it felt like to bring care to the experience of being in my own body, in my own private space, in the silence and the slowness of time claimed entirely for the project of being with myself. Soft fabrics. Gentle colors. Things chosen not for their public meaning but for their private sensory quality, for the way they registered against skin, for the message they sent only to me, received only by me, about the quality of attention I was willing to bring to my own inner experience. It was my mother's language, I understand now. It was the language she had taught me without words, in the wordless curriculum of childhood observation. It was the inheritance finally arrived at, not through instruction but through the long, patient work of finding my own way back to something I had always known. Loneliness is one of the great underappreciated teachers. I do not say this to romanticize it. Loneliness is genuinely painful, genuinely difficult, and I do not wish to suggest otherwise. But I have come to believe that it teaches things that other experiences cannot teach. Specifically, it teaches you to develop a real relationship with yourself, because when the loneliness is deep enough and long enough, you have no other option. You are stuck with yourself. And in being stuck with yourself, you are forced, eventually, to decide what kind of company you intend to be. The years I am describing, the late 20s and through much of the 30s, were years of significant social isolation for me. Not the total isolation of someone without connection, but the particular isolation of someone who moves through social life without feeling fundamentally met within it. I had colleagues and acquaintances, and the various transient connections that urban professional life produces. But I did not have many people with whom I felt the quality of genuine recognition, people for whom the specific texture of my inner life made natural sense. This is not an unusual experience, but it is a lonely one. In loneliness, I turned to myself. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Turning toward yourself requires a willingness to meet what is actually there, not the self you perform for others, not the self you wish you were, but the actual, present, breathing, feeling self that exists in the unmediatized interior of your own experience. That meeting can be uncomfortable. There is often grief in it, and confusion, and the particular disorientation of discovering that you have been stranger to yourself than you realized. But there is also, and this was the discovery that began to change things for me, something else in it. There is the possibility of kindness. The possibility of meeting yourself with something other than judgment, something other than the performance evaluation that so much of social life imposes. The possibility of simply being with yourself the way a good parent is with a child, not requiring you to be other than what you are, not demanding performance, simply present and accepting and gently attending. My mother had modeled this for me. She had been that kind of presence for me as a child, not demanding, not performance-focused, simply attending with a quality of care that asked nothing in return except that I be myself. And she had modeled it also for herself, in those private morning moments I had witnessed, in the way she moved through her own routines with patient self-regard. I began, slowly and imperfectly, and with many backward steps, to extend that quality toward myself. The practice of gentle transformation, which is how I eventually came to understand what I had been building, is at its core a practice of this kind of self-regard. It is not about becoming something other than yourself. It is not about escape or denial or fantasy. It is about the deliberate cultivation of gentleness as a mode of internal relationship. It is about learning to be your own kind of company, the company that your loneliness has been asking you to find. The specific practices matter less than the quality of attention they carry. Whether the practice involves particular clothing or particular routines or particular ways of moving. Through private space, these are expressions of the underlying orientation, which is the orientation of care, of taking yourself seriously as a being who deserves careful attention, of treating your inner life as something worthy of the consideration you might extend to something genuinely precious. I remember specific evenings during this period. Alone in my apartment, the city noise a background texture outside the windows, I would create a small ceremony of presence for myself. Nothing elaborate. A clean, quiet space. Soft light. Music that felt appropriate to the register of the evening. And then time, unhurried time with nowhere to go, spent simply being present with myself, attending to the experience of being in my own body, in my own life, with my own thoughts. And in those evenings, something that had been contracted for years began to open. The chronic tension of living too far from yourself began to ease. I began, in those private hours, to feel something that I can only describe as homecoming, the sense of returning to a place that had been present all along but from which I had been, for too long, absent. This was the teaching of the loneliness. This was what the years of isolation, painful as they were, eventually produced. Not bitterness, not hardening, but the discovery of an interior home, a quality of relationship with my own inner life that did not depend on external validation or social belonging, or any of the structures I had been trying to use to fill what could only be filled from within. What does a practice look like when it has been sustained over years, when it has moved from tentative exploration to something more settled and understood? It looks, I think, like the inside of my mother's house. Not literally, not in its physical contents, though there are similarities in quality, if not in form, but in its character, in the particular attention paid to small things, in the sense that the space and the routines that fill it are not incidental but considered, are not happening by default but are the result of ongoing, intentional care. My mornings, now, are different from the mornings of my earlier adult life. They have a quality of ceremony to them, small ceremony, the kind that is not visible to anyone outside, that carries no significance in the public world, but that carries a great deal of significance for the private person who inhabits it. I move through them slowly, with attention. I have learned from my mother's example that the transition from sleep to waking day is a meaningful passage, worthy of being made with care rather than simply pushed through as quickly as possible in order to get to whatever comes next. There is pleasure in this slowness that took years to learn to access. The culture I was raised in and the professional worlds I inhabited were cultures of productivity, of forward motion, of demonstrated competence, and visible achievement. Slowness was associated with waste. Attention to the quality of private, personal experience was associated with self-indulgence. The inner life was something you managed efficiently on the way to the things that actually mattered. It has taken years to unlearn this. Or perhaps not to unlearn it exactly. The habits of productivity have their place and I have not abandoned them, but to understand that they describe only part of the picture. To understand that the inner life is not an obstacle to be managed, but the very thing that needs to be lived, and that the quality of that living determines, in ways that external achievement cannot, the quality of a human existence. The elements of my practice have evolved. I have learned what serves me and what does not. I have learned the difference between practices that genuinely deepen the quality of my relationship with my inner life and practices that are merely habitual or self-distracting. I have learned to be honest with myself about what I am doing and why, to resist both the temptation to over-explain the practice in terms that make it more acceptable and the temptation to surround it with mystery or drama. It is simply what I do. It is the way I take care of myself at the level that matters most, the level of the inner life, the level of felt experience, the level of whether the person I am when no one is watching is someone I can be with gently, someone I can regard with something approaching the patient, accepting attention that my mother brought to small things. The clothing, the particular textures and qualities I choose for private time, remains part of this practice. But I understand it differently now than I did in the early years. I understand it as what it always was. Not disguise, not performance, not the claiming of an identity in opposition to any other. Simply an extension of the quality of gentleness I am trying to cultivate in my relationship with myself. Fabrics chosen because they are soft. Colors chosen because they register on the senses in ways that support the quality of attention I am trying to maintain. Choices that say, in their small, quiet way, that I am willing to be gentle with myself. That I believe this is allowed. I think of my mother choosing the flowers for the kitchen window. She did not choose them because someone told her to. She did not choose them to impress anyone or to communicate any particular message to the outside world. She chose them because they were beautiful and because having them there made the space in which she lived carry a quality that mattered to her. Because she believed, without having to argue for the belief, simply by enacting it, that the spaces in which we live and the textures we surround ourselves with are not trivial, that they carry meaning and produce feeling, and that attending to them is a way of attending to the self that inhabits them. This is what I am doing. This is what I have always been doing, from the first tentative, confused explorations of my young adult life to the more settled, understood practice of today. I am tending to the interior space. I am choosing things not for their public meaning, but for their private quality. I am trying to live inside my own life with something like the attention and care that I believe all inner lives deserve. The loneliness has not entirely resolved. I do not think it ever does for people of a certain temperament, people who feel things deeply and live significantly inside their own inner experience. But it has changed character. It is no longer the harsh, angular loneliness of early adulthood, the loneliness of a person who cannot find their way back to themselves. It is something softer, more companionable. The loneliness now is often the loneliness of being alone with yourself in a way that feels like enough, not because nothing is missing, but because what is present has enough quality to sustain you. My mother's plan, if it was a plan, and perhaps it was only a way of being, a manner of moving through life that I experienced as intentional because it was so consistent and so particular, her plan has come to completion in me. Not the completion she might have imagined or designed, but the completion that the inheritance actually produced in the person who received it. She gave me a way of relating to the inner life. She gave me permission she never explicitly offered, but that was embedded in every unhurried gesture, every carefully attended small thing, every morning ritual conducted with patience and self-regard, to be gentle with myself. I have simply learned, over years and through difficulty and with many backward steps, to claim that permission. There is a quality of arrival that happens not as a single moment, but as a slow accumulation. Not the dramatic arrival of breakthrough or revelation, but the quiet arrival of having come, through gradual degrees, to a place of recognizable rest. I am in my mid-40s now. I live differently than I lived in my 20s and my 30s, not in external terms, which would not appear dramatically different to any observer, but in internal terms. In the quality of my relationship with my own experience. In the degree to which the person I am in private and the person I am in public are in recognizable relationship with one another, are understood by me as expressions of the same underlying self rather than as separate performances for separate contexts. This is the thing that years of practice, years of returning, again and again, to the private space of gentle attention, have produced. Not transformation in the sense of becoming something other than what I was. Transformation in the sense of becoming more fully, more comfortably, more honestly what I always have been. I think about my mother often. She died several years ago, in the house where I grew up, in the room where I used to watch her brush her hair. She died as she had lived, quietly, with a quality of self-possession that I have spent my life trying to understand and to learn from. I did not speak with her in the years before her death about what I have written about here. This was partly the limitation of language and partly the limitation of our particular relational pattern. She communicated through action, not through discussion, and so did I. But I believe she would have recognized in what I have built something of what she was always trying to give me. She taught me that caring for small things matters. She taught me that the inner life is worthy of patient attention. She taught me that gentleness directed toward oneself is not weakness, but foundation, the necessary groundwork from which it becomes possible to move through the world with any real degree of integrity. What she perhaps did not know, because she could not have known it, because every person's inheritance expresses itself in the specific terms of their particular inner life, was that her teaching would take the specific form it took in me. That the morning rituals I absorbed from watching her would eventually become the template for my own private practice of self-care. That the quality of gentleness she modeled would eventually find expression in the particular way I have learned to be with myself in private space, in the specific textures and choices and unhurried attentions that constitute the practice of what I have come to call, internally, the gentle transformation. Transformation. The word implies change, and change is indeed part of it. But the most accurate version of what is changed is not the self, not who I am in any fundamental sense, but the relationship to the self, the quality of attention, the degree of care, the willingness to be with my own inner experience with the same patient, accepting, unhurried regard that I once watched my mother bring to the flowers in her kitchen window. There are mornings now when I move through my routines and feel something that I would describe as simple rightness. Not happiness in any dramatic sense, not the resolution of all difficulty or the absence of all longing. Simply the quality of being in the right relationship with oneself, present with what is actually here, gentle with what is actually felt, patient with the ongoing and unfinished business of being alive. In those moments, I sometimes sense my mother in the room with me, not in any mystical sense, but in the way that the people who have shaped us are always with us, in the habits of attention they planted, in the qualities of relating they modeled, in the particular textures of care they taught us to recognize and value, and, eventually, to extend toward ourselves. Her plan, if it was a plan, if she sat somewhere in herself and thought, "This child will need a certain kind of teaching, and I will give it to him without words, through example, through the quality of life I build around him," her plan worked. It worked in ways she could not have predicted and might not have imagined. But, at its core, it worked exactly as such things are supposed to work. It passed something real from her to me. It gave me a foundation. I am standing on it now. It is solid. It has held me through years of difficulty and confusion and loneliness and the particular pressures of a life that was often very far from what this practice requires. It holds me still. There is a phrase I return to, a formulation that feels, more than any other, like an accurate description of what the years have taught. I am learning to be at home in myself. Not arrived. Still learning. But closer, substantially, meaningfully closer than I have ever been. And some part of me knows that this is what she wanted. That this was always what she wanted for the quiet, sensitive child who used to sit in her doorway on weekend mornings and watch her brush her hair with the patient attention of someone trying to learn something important without yet knowing what it was. She was teaching me gentleness. She was teaching me home. It has taken my whole life, so far, to learn the lesson. I believe I am finally beginning to understand it.